the hyena of avarice. Hunger, too, became a weapon. The SS reduced food rations to starvation levels. In late 1944, during the final collapse of Nazi Germany, even the trash pits became a source of scraps, and still thousands died of hunger. Any sign of weakness could mean beatings or worse. It was common for guards to take out frustrations violently. Lynn Olson notes that overseers sometimes hurled scissors at women forced to sew, snapping at them if they stumbled over a stitch. A single scissor thrust or a slap could draw blood on those hollow, shaked faces. The camp had no mercy. As the British historian Sarah Helm later wrote, "With time, one wishes to be a hermit or dead." An irony spoken by Dr. Mazza that captures how Ravensbrück stripped women of hope. Surrounded by machines and fences, the inmates formed their own secret societies. Prisoners came from myriad backgrounds, but here they discovered shared humanity. They would cook hiding spots for stolen potatoes, snatch moments to sing forbidden songs, and share a comforting cup of lukewarm soup by the barracks' dim light. Memoirs describe small acts of kindness. One woman would slip an extra crust of bread into another's blanket. In the women's blocks, young prisoners often took care of the oldest and sickest. They whispered reassurances like illicit letters. In this commune of suffering, as one survivor put it, friendships and sisterhood became a lifeline. The anthropologist Germaine Tillian, who would survive Ravensbrück and later documented, spoke movingly of the remarkable camaraderie that formed among the prisoners. In the face of systematic cruelty, this solidarity was an act of quiet rebellion. Ravensbrück was at its heart a killing machine. Even before the war's end, the SS used it to carry out mass murder and atrocity. Deep within the camp's bureaucracy was a grim ledger of lives extinguished. In 1941, the Nazis began sending their first expendables from Ravensbrück to the gas chambers of Action T4. Jewish inmates deemed unfit for labor were transported to killing centers. One such transfer was to the Bernburg euthanasia site where hundreds were gassed in the chapel's oven. In parallel came Action 14 of 13. Sick or disabled prisoners of Ravensbrück were secretly marked and murdered in the name of euthanasia. Tens of thousands passed through the camp's gates, but as a memorial historian notes, tens of thousands of them were murdered, died of hunger and disease, or were killed in medical experiments. In other words, roughly half of the women who came here never made it to liberation. Even within the camp walls, death was commonplace. Starting around 1941 to 42, executions by firing squad became routine. The tall concrete wall behind the camp's barracks was the site of innumerable shootings. Prisoners would be lined up with wooden blocks under their chins, never to rise again. Those who fell at rifle fire ended up in mass graves outside the camp. Medical experiments were another lethal weapon. In the hospital block, SS doctors performed unspeakable torture under the guise of research. Karl Gart, Himmler's personal surgeon, arrived at Ravensbrück to conduct experiments on wounded legs. He would deliberately break or cut prisoners' bones, infect the wounds with bacteria, tetanus, gangrene, gas gangrene, and filth, then try various sulfur drugs to prove them useless. Women who had their legs shattered often had faded bandages and dirty instruments pressed into their flesh. Many bled to death on the table. Those who survived lived with lifetimes of pain and disability. Gart even tried amputating and transplanting limbs between slave laborers and wounded German soldiers, a grotesque reverse mercy. His chief assistant, Dr. Hera Oberheiser, was later convicted at Nuremberg for her role in these human vivisections. In 1943 and 1944, the injections changed, but not the victims. Chemical poisons were given under the guise of vitamin shots, and pregnant prisoners were subjected to sterilizing experiments. All in all, as many as 40,000 inmates died at Ravensbrück through starvation, disease, torture, shooting, lethal injection, and gassing. In late 1944, as the Red Army approached, the killing accelerated. The SS set up a provisional gas chamber in a wooden shed next to the crematorium. Between January and April 1945, nearly 5,000 to 6,000 women and about 100 of the camp's men were murdered there. They inhaled Cyclone B through makeshift vents and were cremated in Fenberg's ovens. Even in its final horrific acts, Ravensbrück had routine. New arrivals, often Polish women from Auschwitz and other camps, were exhausted and half-naked. A survivor's drawing titled Arrival shows hundreds of huddled figures entering through the main gate. Hours later, another drawing 2 hours later depicts many collapsed on the ground, too weak to stand. The fate of these new prisoners depended on arbitrary selection. Those who looked healthy enough were sent to work. The rest, the old, the very young, the ill, were marched off to the showers and never returned. By the end, the selection was nearly continuous. A Kripo van would claim a dozen old women from the infirmary each day for summary execution. In the last desperate months, officials kept lists of the chronically ill just so they could mark them for death. When Surin ordered evacuation, he left 2,000 very sick women behind who were unable to march. The Red Army found their bodies piled in the camp hospital as evidence. Amid this daily nightmare, small sparks of humanity and resistance glowed. The women of Ravensbrück never surrendered their will to resist. Clandestine networks formed across barracks and nationalities in French, Polish, or German tongues. Inmates passed messages on scraps of paper. They sabotaged the war effort whenever they could, sewing errors into uniforms, mixing broken tools on assembly lines, hiding metal pieces in latrines. One group secretly stitched together a tiny opera complete with music and lyrics to sing in whispers during brief moments of leisure. Another group conservatively kept a few jars of jam saved over years, trading a spoonful in secret for a warm smile. Some inmates showed remarkable courage. Many of the camp's 130,000 female prisoners were themselves resistors. Those women had fought Hitler's armies with guns or sabotage back home, and even here they refused to break. French women organized clandestine cells under the noses of the SS. A remarkable case was Geneviève de Gaulle Antonio's, the 19-year-old niece of Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle Antonio had worked in the French resistance and was captured in 1943. At Ravensbrück, she told fellow prisoners about her uncle's promise of victory. She secretly circulated news of Allied advances and whispered hope from barrack to barrack. Her presence was a rallying point. In the words of a historian, she was incredibly important in keeping up the spirits of the French women there. Even in the camp's hell, telling those words kept alive the idea that the world outside was fighting on. Polish prisoners, many of them young students, maintained their national dignity. When Nazis arrived with Polish women who had been captured in Warsaw after the 1944 uprising, the camp's Poles befriended them and smuggled them extra food, fearing the worst. Some of the Warsaw women had been secretly photographed at Ravensbrück. Those images, discovered after liberation, remain some of the few photographic records of daily life in the camp. And then there were the quiet acts of solidarity. Older women teaching the very young how to survive. Pregnant women looking after one another in pain and stripping blankets for warmth. After Ravensbrück was liberated, survivors would speak of how they called themselves sisters bound by their ordeal. As anthropologist Germaine Tillian later wrote, even amidst the terror, remarkable camaraderie took root. In a place designed to dehumanize, these women had rehumanized each other, becoming caretakers, mothers, and friends to total strangers. As Nazi Germany collapsed in spring 1945, Ravensbrück's days were numbered. On orders from Himmler, guards were preparing to empty the camp. Beginning in April 1945, the SS arranged for roughly 7,500 weakened inmates, mostly French, Norwegian, and Polish women, to be evacuated under Red Cross protection to neutral Sweden, Switzerland, and France. Swedish Count Folk Bernard's white buses drove some of these survivors across the Baltic. For those who remained, Surin ordered a forced evacuation. About 20,000 prisoners, women, girls, and a few guards were sent west on death marches into the forests of Mecklenburg. On April 30th, 1945, Soviet troops finally reached Ravensbrück. They found around 2,000 sick or dying prisoners left behind in the hospital. Most of them were emaciated beyond recognition. A few dozen of the camp's Nazi guards were paraded out and handed over to the Soviets. Elsewhere, many guards quietly fled or hid. The Red Army took control, liberating the remaining inmates. Because Ravensbrück was cleared so late and because it fell behind Soviet lines, few Western journalists documented the moment. In film after film of Nazi liberation, Ravensbrück's black and white image is often missing. Yet the survivors remember. For those who survived the camp itself, the ordeal was only half over. Many liberated women were too weak to care for themselves. Weeks after freedom, hundreds died of disease and exhaustion. Dr. Doris Maza recovered only slowly. She and others would spend years just regaining enough weight and strength to walk. Psychological scars ran deep. The memory of screams in the night and the pile of corpses in the yard would haunt survivors for decades. In the months after the war, former prisoners learned that some of their comrades had not been so lucky. When Marza finally reached Geneva in summer 1945, she and others mourned the loss of perhaps tens of thousands of fellow Ravensbrück prisoners who had died or been murdered. The world, however, began to reckon with what happened here in Nuremberg and subsequent trials. Former Ravensbrück personnel were held to account. Karl Gart, the camp doctor, was convicted of war crimes and sentenced to death. He was hanged in 1948. Hera Oberhäuser, the only woman tried at Nuremberg's doctor's trial, received 20 years in prison. Camp Commandant Fritz Surin was extradited to France, tried and executed by firing squad in 1950. Irma Gracer, whose cruelty was honed at Ravensbrück and Ackwitz, was tried by the British and hanged at just 22. Many lower guards were captured by Soviets or Americans. Some disappeared into the post-war chaos, while a few like Maria Mundell were later caught and punished. Music. In the decades that followed, Ravensbrück faded from general memory, overshadowed by the larger camps of Avitz and Belsen, but its story lived on through survivors' voices. These women spoke, wrote, and testified. French prisoner Charlotte Delot dedicated much of her life to writing about Ravensbrück and Ackwitz. Her memoirs Avitz and After preserve the personal truths of the camp experience. Germaine Tillian published accounts of Ravensbrück in the 1950s and 1970s, ensuring historians and new generations would not forget. In 1973, she wrote of the camaraderie among prisoners and the ethical imperative to remember everything, so as not to be overwhelmed by such events today. The ruins of Ravensbrück are a memorial. An entry sign greets visitors in quiet fields where once surveillance towers stood. Exhibits display the few remaining photographs and artifacts. A scorched shoe, a discarded spoon, a Star of David from a prisoner's dress. Guided tours recount how tens of thousands of women and girls passed through here. In 2015, for example, historians counted 130,000 registered prisoners, including 48,500 Poles, 28,000 Soviets, and thousands from France, Hungary, and Germany. The names of those who died, at least 30,000 by conservative estimates, are known to scholars, but each name is a story. More than 70 years on, Ravensbrück remains a somber classroom. This place asks questions of us, says a curator at the Memorial Museum. How could human beings do this to one another? What does it mean that the camp had only women on one side and female guards on the other? The answer lies not only in Nazi ideology, but in the everyday choices made here. The guards chose cruelty. The prisoners often chose compassion. In the shadow of that barbed wire, small acts of kindness or defiance became heroic. As one survivor quoted by Lynn Olson reflected, even amid the cruelty, people must stay people. A simple demand in the face of the camp's horror. That spirit of humanity tested in the darkest of times is Ravensbrück's true legacy. Music. Under a gray northern sky in 1939, long wooden barracks like these became home to Ravensbrück's first prisoners. This remote camp built on the edge of a swampy forest about 50 miles north of Berlin was destined to be the Nazi Reich's largest concentration camp for women. Over the next 6 years, the camp would expand relentlessly, enclosing forests with high fences and watchtowers. By its end, it would imprison tens of thousands of women and girls from all over Europe, leaving behind a legacy of horror and survival. The origins of Ravensbrück trace back to the broader aims of the Nazi regime to consolidate its control over society through a rapidly expanding system of concentration camps. After Adolf Hitler's rise to power in 1933, the Nazi government under the control of the SS Shuttle, a paramilitary organization led by Heinrich Himmler, began building camps across Germany to imprison, punish, and ultimately annihilate those they deemed undesirable. By the late 1930s, existing camps were overcrowded, and the Nazi leadership saw a need for a dedicated facility to imprison women. On Himmler's orders, the SS began constructing a new concentration camp exclusively for women in 1938 near the village of Ravensbrück, about 90 kilometers north of Berlin. The site was chosen for its relative isolation and proximity to Berlin, which allowed for centralized administration and ease of transport. The camp officially opened in May 1939 and quickly became the central hub of a network of subcamps. Over the next 6 years, more than 130,000 women and children along with thousands of men would be imprisoned there. In its first year, it received the inmates of the closed Lemberg women's camp. From the start, Ravensbrück was designed almost entirely for female prisoners. A separate men's compound was later added in April 1941, followed in mid-1942 by a nearby juvenile protective custody camp at Uekerk for teenage girls. At first, the camp had only about 18 barracks and could hold a few thousand people. By 1943, a crematorium was built on site, and by 1945, a crude gas chamber. It was originally intended for some 6,000 inmates, but despite its modest beginnings, Ravensbrück swelled to hold over 36,000 prisoners at the end of the war. The Nazis populated Ravensbrück with the people they most despised or feared. From the first transports, it held men and women labeled as social political enemies and others. SS records list the types of inmates, political prisoners, asocials, a Nazi term that included many Roma Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others classified as criminals, work-shy, or race defilers. As the war spread, women from across Europe were sent to Ravensbrück. By 1942 and 1943, large transports came from occupied Poland and the Soviet Union. Eventually, inmates came from over 30 countries. The largest groups were Polish women and Soviet citizens along with Germans and Austrians, Hungarians, French, and many others. Among them were resistance fighters, forced laborers, gypsies, Jews, and clergymen. A cross-section of the peoples Europe's conquerors had deemed expendable. Ravensbrück's commanders were SS officers brought in from other camps. The first commandant G.A. Tomaszka served briefly in 1939. He was followed by SS Captain Max Kogel at the start of 1940 and then by Fritz Surin from August 1942 until the fall of the Reich. Surin became infamous after the war. A French tribunal convicted him of war crimes and executed him in 1950. Each commandant oversaw an organization that included a political department, a camp doctor, and guards, most of them women trained as ALSA Inan overseers at Ravensbrück. Over the camp's life, thousands of female SS guards passed through here. From the first arrivals, the message was clear. This place was a world set apart. A rigid society of cruel hierarchy where the prisoners, half naked, starving, and frightened, were utterly powerless. Daily life in Ravensbrück was a slow slide into suffering. Prisoners rose at dawn for brutal roll calls in the gravel yard, standing hours to count each body. Winter snow crunched underfoot. Summer dust filled the air. Food was meager. A watery soup and a thin slice of black bread, leaving every woman gaunt. Many simply wasted away from hunger. Disease and lice were rampant in the overcrowded barracks, spreading fever and death. After a while, we never accepted lifts and didn't dare go near any villages, recalled one survivor. Even outside the wire, fear and weakness kept the prisoners captive. Dr. Doris Maza, a camp physician, later wrote that eventually one wishes to be a hermit instead of always being around people. A quiet testament to how life there eroded the human spirit. The women were forced into endless labor. Originally, the first inmates helped build the camp itself. By 1942, the SS pressed Ravensbrück prisoners into making war supplies. Within the walls, an industrial complex grew, where inmates did factory work and machine jobs. Even tasks thought suitable for women became brutal grinds, sewing fatigues for the VE, knitting uniforms, weaving blankets, or knotting cords in teams under watchful guards. The Siemens Company ran 20 workshops outside the camp starting in 1942, where shackled prisoners labored on electrical parts. These tasks carried out from dawn till dusk for little food broke many bodies. Women who could no longer work were segregated and often forgotten. Underneath it all was constant violence. Female SS guards patrolled every aisle of barracks and factory floor. Some newcomers to the SS adorned the camp with white cuffs and embroidered collars, but those decorations could not mask the cruelty. The brutality had a perverse normality. One survivor recalled that some prisoners would play a sad little game, betting how quickly a newly arrived female guard would lose all compassion and join in the brutality. It was widely understood in Ravensbrück that the most vicious guards were prized by the SS. They were regarded as the most proven among the SS. As one witness later observed, many guards reveled in their roles. Maria Mundel and SS Oberärin would later testify, with complete frankness, that she found nothing wrong with the camp's harsh regime. Another young Alferin, Irma Graca, sharpened her reputation for cruelty right here. She arrived at Ravensbrück at age 18 and learned the overseer's trade. Later at Avitz, she earned infamy as